Welcome everyone. We are going to be looking at AP US History, Period 3, Part 2, 1787 through 1801. This is going to piggyback on the last lecture that we did that took us through the Revolutionary War time period and into the Articles of Confederation. So this is going to be post-Constitution, pretty much. It's going to be all about the Constitution, the forming of the Constitution, and then this first 12 years under Federalist rule, under 8 years of Washington and 4 years of Adams. So let's get started. So right away, we're going to need to look at the Articles of Confederation. What was the flaws in that? And then how that was adapted within the Constitution itself. So real quickly, a little recap. The Articles of Confederations were an extremely weak set of rules. It had a weak national government with no executive branch, no judicial branch at all. So very little power at the very top. In this situation, states had most of the power. And actually, the states took that power and acted very individualistically rather than a United States, sort of like a confederation of jointed states. And there was a big conflict between big and small states that arose because of this. In the Congress, each state only had one single vote, regardless of population size. There was no power to tax, and also the states could tax each other's goods. So this set up a lot of problems that were going to come about in those years after the Revolution, but before the Constitution. So they'll have a convention to create a new set of laws, really to adapt these set of laws. They went into it looking to adapt and modify these. What they came up with was fully scrapping the old system and coming up with a brand new system. They were going to meet in May of 1787, 55 delegates from all the different states. Two people that were a big part of the first set of laws and the Declaration of Independence will be in Europe, serving as ambassadors, both for France and England, with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson serving there. We're also going to have two new sets of faces that are going to be very integral in this early period of American history. James Madison from Virginia and Alexander Hamilton from New York. Both will become very staunch Federalists who are going to be supporters of the Constitutions. Eventually, Madison is going to change his viewpoint later on in the 1780s and 90s to become more of a Jeffersonian or anti-Federalist in his mindsets. Okay, Virginia plan, cast by the Virginia delegates. One, they wanted a national authority, a central government that had the power to overturn state laws. They wanted a national republic, drew power from all the nation's people and had direct power over them. So they didn't want to have a direct democracy, but a representative democracy, pretty much is what that's stating. They wanted a separation of powers and a three-tiered system of government, meaning they wanted basically an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch. Eventually, this legislative branch is going to become two houses. At the very start, though, they wanted most of the power to be given to the population, the populous states, the states like Virginia, New York, and the larger states. Their plan gave them basically this lower house, this huge amounts of power based off their population. Okay, obviously this was not going to fly with all of the smaller states. New Jersey came up with a plan proposed by William Patterson to protect small states. One part of his plan was that it was going to give the national government the power to raise taxes. It also, right here, gave the power to equal power to each state regardless of size. So again, sort of mimicking the Articles of Confederation. And that was not going to be very good for those larger states. So what's going to happen is going to be the Connecticut Compromise. It's also called the Great Compromise, where you're going to split the legislative branch into two different sections. One house, being the Senate, would have 2 seats for each state. This would be the upper house. And that was going to be to take the smaller states into account. The lower house, the House of Representatives, will be based on population. And that will give obviously more power to states like Virginia and New York. And the only group that the people directly elect. So this is going to be the only group in the early form of government that the people will directly elect. The president, the upper house will both be elected by either electors or state delegates. So again, this was really important because it gave the power of the elite the ability to really run the government and make changes within the government. Because again, most of these first Americans did not trust the masses. So this was to basically to protect America, the democracy, the government from the masses of the people. Also in the Great Compromise, they dealt with an issue of slavery. They created the Fugitives Clause, which escaped slaves would have to be returned across state boundaries. They also created the Three-Fifths Compromise, which would allow for 3/5 of a slave to be counted as a person. This was a compensation to the South. The South wanted every slave to be counted as a person for their popular vote. And of course, the northern states wanted them to be counted at 0. So this was a compromise. So every 3 slaves or every 5 slaves would be counted as 3 people in the state's population. So 3/5. Also, republicanism was a big part of this Constitution, where most government positions will be elected by the representatives, not from the popular vote. So our federal government is run as a representative democracy, or a republicanism, where a lot of our state and our local elections and our local laws are direct democracy, where the people actually have a direct say in the outcome of an individual law or order. And there's going to be a huge debate over the constitutionality and the creation of this. There'll be a debate over this ratification. They need a unanimous consent to be approved, and 2 groups are going to form, the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, with the Federalists being the strong supporters of a strong national government, and the Anti-Federalists not wanting a new constitution, but wanting it modified and changed to give states and individuals more protections. The Anti-Federalists, the weaker of the two, also just their name themselves, lend them to be not as strongly supported. They feared this strong central government would impose their will over the people like the King of England did. They were really worried about high taxes, standing armies, an oppressive regime, or even maybe the executive branch becoming almost like this pseudo-monarchy. They believed that Congress had way too much powers over the states themselves. And they also, probably their biggest and strongest issue was having no direct protection for the individual rights and freedoms. They believed that they needed to have an actual Bill of Rights added to this Constitution to protect the abuse of federal government over the individuals of people and states. The Federalists liked this strong central government. They thought that there was no need for a Bill of Rights because there was checks and balances, separation of powers, that those checks and balances themselves would protect the abuse of powers because every single branch would overlap each other's authority. They also thought they needed a judicial branch to check the other 2 branches and also to check the states themselves. So they thought that a judicial branch had to be added into this Constitution. They also wanted a common currency. They believed in Republican form of governments because, again, they did not trust the masses. They wanted to keep sort of the elite at the top. And to support this new ideology, they wrote the Federalist Papers to help gain support for the ratification of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, with Hamilton writing the bulk of the 80-plus papers, and Jay only writing a couple of them. Probably the most important ones that come up are Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. Those are about the powers of checks and balances and separation of powers, the worry about political parties and partisanship and stuff like that. Eventually, the Constitution will be ratified with the promise that the Federalists will add a Bill of Rights to this in a form of several amendments. Eventually, we're going to see James Madison write several amendments, and 10 of them will be adopted into this Constitution, being our Bill of Rights. New York and Virginia were the last states to accept this. Eventually, it will be signed in 1787, and the Bill of Rights will be added and amended into this Constitution in 1791. Again, this was to basically appease the Anti-Federalist. Okay, the 10th Amendment is one of those amendments that does come up on the AP test. of those first 10. Typically, we don't see many Bill of Rights on the AP test, but you will see the 10th Amendment occasionally. You also will see like the 13th Amendment, the 15th, the 18th, the 21st, other ones like that. And the 19th, of course, women's right to vote. So the 10th Amendment is all powers not specifically delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states and the people. This will set up additional conflicts because the whole aspect that the states themselves do have a certain level of rights and independence outside the government itself, meaning that the states can enact and nullify different aspects of the Constitution that they see that is unconstitutional. Again, this will set up future debates and future conflicts about who has more power, the states or the federal government, and where does the power lie. Okay, the Washington presidency. For 8 years, Washington will become president. He is really the only president that will have unanimous consent for him being elected. Once he gets elected, he's going to create a cabinet. The first president to do so, and then every president after him will then also have this sort of cabinet or advisors that they'll set up. His cabinet's going to be created with one of the main important people be Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton was a lawyer from New York City. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury. He had huge, major issues with the amount the economy and the money that America owed and how we were going to pay that back after the Revolutionary War. So he had a very sort of a distinct fiscal three-part plan to get us economically soluble again. Okay, part of this plan was public credit. His first part of the plan was to basically repay all the debt and all the basic Confederate currency, all these notes that were out there at face value rather than a depreciated value. What that would do is that would basically allow America to have credit because we are paying back our credit at face value, meaning that we're going to be trusted in the future to take out loans. It's going to give us that trust that our currency is a sound currency that can be trusted. It's very controversial because obviously these currencies and these notes were so depreciated because of the war and the over printing of these. Also, there's a lot of controversy because a lot of the people in Congress and the elite had basically bought back currency at hugely speculated margins, meaning that they bought it for very cheap, knowing that they're going to be paid back at a higher price. And the big issue with this would actually create a permanent national debt, which means that eventually that debt will have to be paid back. James Madison was very much against this plan. This is where James Madison starts to sort of turn against Hamilton and his Federalist ideologies. And again, the biggest issue of this was that speculators would only get market value for these notes. That's what he wanted. In reality, this plan will pass at 36-13 in the House of Representatives. The second part of the plan is that the government's going to assume all the war debt of the states, regardless of how much it is. The problem with this, of course, is that some of the states had already paid back their debts. And so Hamilton modified his plan to reimburse those states also. To get these plans passed, along with a new Bank of the United States, a government had to make concessions. So Hamilton made concessions to Madison and Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists, or these new Jeffersonians, to basically change the capital from New York City to where it's going to be located presently, Washington, D.C. In the interim, while Washington, D.C. was going to be being built, the capital was going to be temporarily relocated to Philadelphia. Okay, the biggest controversial of this new Constitution and this new form of government is the Bank of America. Not the Bank of America, but the Bank of the United States, the first Bank of the United States. In 1790, Congress will ask to charter the Bank of the U.S., and Jefferson says this is unconstitutional because there's no direct statement in the Constitution that says we're allowed to have a bank. He says that if it's not enumerated, means that there's no direct wordage in the Constitution, it should not be allowed. Hamilton, on the other side, said, you know what, no, this bank's important. It would make loans to merchants. It would handle government funds or taxes are coming in. It would also issue financial notes, which are all things that are allowed to happen in the Constitution. Therefore, it's implied that we are also allowed to have a bank run by the federal government. So this is using implied powers, or this elastic clause. So basically, this elastic clause, implied powers, is very important to know about, because it's going to come up over and over and over again, especially in other aspects of the of U.S. history. And the Constitution. Two big things to know about in this is that between the enumerated and implied powers, enumerated powers were powers specifically stated in the Constitution. These are people that are Jeffersonians who pretty much believe in this. They're also called strict constructionalists. People believe in implied powers, or powers not specifically stated in the Constitution, believe that the clause, the necessary or proper clause, or the elastic clause, could give legality or constitutionality to things that were indirectly in the Constitution. That means that if they're implied, then you're allowed to still do them. This is called loose constructionalism, and Hamilton and Federalists were the backers of this. Eventually, we're going to see Hamilton create a report on manufacturing. Basically, it's a report on the debt and the taxes that need to be created to produce revenue to pay off the debt that we have. So therefore, we're going to see our national revenue and taxes have to be used to pay back our national debt. There's two ways to do this. One way was internal taxation, which was going to be created, such as a whiskey tax. There's going to be a lot of debate around this because obviously the whiskey tax and these internal taxes were one thing that we were very much against the English doing when we were still under the English flag. The other thing that we're going to have to do to pay back our debt was create a tax on foreign goods, or basically a tariff. This was going to be two-folded. Not only would it help pay back our debt, it would also help protect our brand new burgeoning industries that were now trying to compete against the British industries. Okay, Thomas Jefferson was going to be very much against this plan. He basically thought that America should be more of an agrarian and democratic nation, a nation of small farm owners, each owned their own land, educated farm owners that were part of this democratic process, this Enlightenment idea that every person should have a ability to be a farmer or own land. This was sort of contradictory because he also was a slave owner himself, and so a lot of what Jefferson thought and believed in and practiced was contradictory what his sort of stances were. So he was somebody who was very much against implied powers, but he'll use those implied powers to buy Louisiana Purchase. He was someone who thought that every person in America should have the democratic basis of owning land and voting, but he also was a slave owner too. So again, he sort of contradicted his ideology quite a bit. And in this aspect, he thought being a farmer and owning land was seen as democratic. And the thought was that because since you're a farm owner and own land, you could therefore vote. And this also was a part of an ideology of you have to have more land to farm. And so you have to remove Native Americans to get more land for white Americans. So again, which is sort of contradictory. And again, it's going to be a huge amount of debate over should America be more of industrialized in the way that Hamilton thought America should look like, or should we be more of an agrarian nation the way that Jefferson thought America should look like? Okay, war and politics. During the same time period, the French Revolution war was happening. Many Americans would sympathize with the French, especially these Jeffersonians or Southerners. Also, we see the French and the British starting to go to war with each other. And both of these countries wanted American backing. They wanted American alliances. Washington claimed neutrality. We did not want to get into war. The reason why is because America just was not ready to gain into war. We were not financially, we weren't militarily ready to be part of another war. The French will send Edmond Guéné, who will come over to America. Instead of going to directly talk with Washington, he will go into the South to try to get support and rile up local support for his ideology and France before he sides with Washington himself. And that's going to be a major controversy. In this time period also, we see the Royal Navy starting to seize American ship and impressing American sailors, which means stopping ships, seizing goods, and taking sailors off of the American ships. And this is going to be a major problem there. We're going to send John Jay over to England to broker a deal with the British, which we deal with, and it will create Jay's Treaty. The problem with Jay's Treaty is that it doesn't really deal with this issue of impressment at all. It does deal with basically the British repaying pre-Revolutionary War debts, and British would have to repay all illegal seizure ships, but it didn't really stop them from continuing to impress or stop American vessels. We're also going to see the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Many Western Pennsylvania farmers were very much against Hamilton's whiskey tax, and so they rebelled. And Washington raised an army of 12,000 troops and himself went to the front lines to stop this rebellion, and it proved that the Constitution could work and was able to put down local rebellions or uprisings. And this is a great chart to look at, basically knowing the differences between the Federalists or the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans. The leaders is right there. We see with the Federalists, we see Washington, John Jay, John Marshall, Hamilton, John Adams. We see the vision, economy based on commerce and industrialization. We see them believing in strong governmental power of the federal government. Again, most of their supporters are going to be from the Northeast and more the wealthier, the elite. We see their viewpoint of the Constitution being very loose or using implied powers. Of course, they were in favor of the national bank, and mostly they were sympathetic to the British within international policy. The Democratic Republicans, their major leaders were Jefferson, Madison, and eventually Monroe. They believed that the economy should be based on agriculture and small agrarian utopian societies. They believed that the state should retain most of the powers. And of course, most of their supporters were Westerners and Southerners and small yeoman farmers. They believed that we should only look at the Constitution strictly. And of course, they thought the national bank was not necessary, but just desirable. And of course, they thought more towards the French sympathies than English sympathies. Okay, once in 8 years, Washington will bow down. He could have run for a third term. He decided to only run for 2 terms, thus setting precedent that pretty much American presidents will only run for 2 terms, and that he'll be basically that'll happen, except for one president in the 1940s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So in the election of 1796, John Adams wins, and he'll run against Jefferson. Jefferson at the time period was the second place victor, so he'll be elected as the vice president. And we see here the electoral map between those two. Again, we see mostly the Northeast and the East Coast voting for Adams, and the South and the West voting for these Democratic Republicans and Jefferson. So Washington will give his famous farewell address where he'll warn against 2 things. He'll warn against the formation of political parties. He will also warn against permanent alliances, saying basically permanent alliances will wheel us into foreign conflict. Okay, in the Adams presidencies, a couple of things that are of note is the XYZ affair, where the French were harassing American sailors and American vessels. So we sent diplomats to France to deal with this issue. The French government refuses to speak with us without a bribe. So Adams will label these French diplomats as X, Y, and Z, and he will not negotiate with them from there on out. Instead of negotiating with them or paying any type of tribute or anything like that, he decides to basically build a modern navy. So we could say Adams is the founder of American Navy, and then using that new navy to harass French ships on the open seas. So we don't officially go to war with France, but it's called a quasi-war because we were both so harassing our merchant vessels on the open seas. Also, Adams was very worried about that his Federalist Party was losing connection to the people and losing delegates and losing popularity. So he wanted to make sure that the Federalists continue to have strength. So he'll craft, along with Congress, the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act basically allowed the exportation of any foreign person outside the country. Allows it basically to expel foreigners if we want to. The Sedition Acts allowed us to jail anyone who writes scandalous or malice things about the Congress, the America, or the president himself, and was really aimed at destroying the Democrat Republicans in the media and being able to expel foreigners who typically came in being Jeffersonians and Democrat Republicans. In reaction to this, the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution will be written by Jefferson and James Madison. They will basically state that the individual states made the Constitution, therefore they have the right to nullify different parts of the Constitution that they deem unconstitutional. The states could judge the constitutionality of federal laws. If they believe that they were not right, they could deem them unconstitutional. And this will set up a huge amount of precedent in the future for states to have lots of rights against the federal government. In 1800, the election will come down to a split vote. Adams will run against Jefferson, and in this election, basically, Jefferson and Burr will be tied. The delegates for the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans don't switch up enough of the votes. So it will go to the House of Representatives, where eventually Jefferson's going to win on a narrow margin because Hamilton will cast favor for Jefferson over Burr. This is going to cause a major amount of turmoil within Burr, which will eventually cause Burr to duel with Alexander Hamilton and kill him. Well, that'll be for next chapter. But in this, Jefferson will win this election, and Jefferson will call this the Revolution, a revolution of 1800 for several reasons. One, it shows that we can have a peaceful transfer of power between one political party and another political party without a coup d'etat or without a military takeover. It also shows that American feelings were switching from a Federalist ideology to a Jeffersonian ideology. So we see both a revolution in the sense of a change of power. We also see a revolution in change of ideology also. And the last little bit, the Judiciary Act of 1801. So after the election of 1800, the Supreme Court was going to be the only federal organization that was going to be led by Federalists. So to solidify that, the Congress, before they were ousted out of office in March, they are going to pass the Judiciary Act of 1801, which will increase the number of federal judges in both the lower courts and Supreme Court to allow Adams to fill more positions within these lower courts prior to his leaving office and Jefferson's inauguration. These are going to be called Adams's midnight appointments, where he's going to flood the courts with new positions and new federal judges that are going to be filled with Federalist-minded judges. He'll do this right before he leaves office, and will leave the delivering of these appointments to Jefferson himself, which will be a huge controversy in regards to the case Marbury versus Madison, which we'll talk about again in period 4. Okay, a DBQ example for this time period, and here it is. It's evaluate the extent to which the ratification of the United States Constitution fostered political change in the United States from 1777 to 1800. So again, the big thing is evaluate the extent. That means how much was there political change? So again, evaluate the extent to which the ratification of the United States Constitution fostered political change in the United States. So was this political change due to the Constitution itself? How much political change happened in this time period of basically 23 years? And that was, again, and using the Constitution as a background for this. But remember, steps for the DBQ, especially for the 2020 DBQ, first thing you do is break down the problem. What is being asked of you? Again, remember extent, right? That word right there is how much. So you need to have a thesis that shows how much will political change happen? Was it going to be a very little or a whole bunch? We want to see a biased response here, okay? Okay, and also we want to see reasoning in your thesis too. Brain drain. First thing you do is take a minute to come up with basically new information, some material that's outside the documents that could be on this. Then you read and annotate the documents, and this should take no longer than 15 minutes. Hopefully, in the 2020 DBQ, it would take about 10 minutes or so. On the 2020 rubric, again, it's a 10-point scale. Remember, you want to use this 10-point scale, know what you can do. This is pretty much, what you see on this essay, it's going to be an introduction paragraph or your thesis paragraph. Then typically, instead of having 3 or 4 body paragraphs, you probably have 2 body paragraphs and then a conclusion paragraph. So it's a slightly shorter essay for this new format. 1 point for a defensible thesis, which means you address the whole prompt and you establish a line of reasoning, which means you show some argumentation within your thesis. Second point is have a contextualization right before your thesis. So show basically a broader historical contents right before you go to your thesis. Okay, describe at least 2 documents, you get a point. You support an argument in response to the prompt using these 2 documents, with additional point being earned for the second document, 2 documents, which up to 2 points. You use 1 or 2 additional pieces of evidence, which is up to 2 points. And then for 2 documents, or for 1 or 2 documents, you show the document's point of view, the purpose, historical situation, or audience. And the very last one, your kick-ass essay point, you corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument to address the prompt, 1 point. And here's the documents. I'm not going to go through those with you, but I'll give you a couple seconds. So you can always pause this and look at the documents if you want to write this and use it as a practice. This is document 1, Articles of Federation. Document 2, Brutus, number 1, which is a response to the Federalist Papers. Document 3, the Federalist number 45 by James Madison. Document 4, a political cartoon from the Massachusetts Sentinel. Again, you see the date, June 11th, 1788. So this is a response to the Constitution being written and passed. And then document 5 are those basically the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in response to those sedition acts. There you go. There's period 3 for you. I hope all studying is very good. There is a chance that we may see a DBQ on this period of time, so please prepare for that. And until next time, you guys have a great day.